As you can see, it's a wet and rather nasty afternoon in early September on a part of the northern slope of Exmoor where the woods slope down to the sea. Over the next 2 weeks, this small group of people and I myself are going to try and live off what nature provides, to depend on what's naturally available for our food, for our shelter, and for everything else that we need. Just for the moment, we have made a few compromises. Apart from my glasses and the clothes, which are pretty bulky, that we're all wearing, we have brought along one or two other things. This is a bag of oats. It weighs about 30 pounds. If we were just to live off this, we wouldn't last very long. It'd only last us a few days. We've also brought with us a fleece. We could get this by killing one of the neighborhood sheep, but short of that, the only way we could get it was by bringing it with us. The other thing is some wire, a bill hook, one or two bits of string, and each of us has got a knife. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, a box of matches. Now, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to try and manage to do without these things, so that at the end of the 2 weeks, we've really gone back to nature. The place we'd chosen, by kind permission of the owner, was a wild mixture of wood and moorland, a large private estate as remote as possible from the outside world. Our team of survivors were volunteers from as wide a variety of everyday backgrounds as possible. Barry and Barbara Onslow own a dress shop in Llanelli, South Wales. In the end, Barbara was unable to join us, and 32-year-old Barry had to come by himself. Les Middlecut, who's 50, works as a builder on an estate in Gloucestershire. His wife, Joyce, teaches handicrafts in a school near Cheltenham. The youngest members of the group were a former student just down from university where he studied anthropology, Tony Beaton, and his girlfriend, 20-year-old Maggie Clegg, who's a trainee nurse. The very first day on Exmoor turned out to be a trial by storm. Tony clung to the hillside, trying to gather heather for bedding.
My first thoughts about this place was that it was like being dumped in a Siberian prison camp in appalling weather conditions, doing horrible tasks which I'd never dream of doing anywhere else.
We'd all spent a couple of weekends together by way of training, but nothing had prepared Maggie for weather as bad as this.
I really hated it. I wanted to go home. It didn't last very long. It's just when the weather was very miserable and everything was very difficult.
The first priority we knew was to make a shelter where we could get out of the weather, so we spent half the first day cutting reeds on the moor to thatch the roof of our bivouac. It was difficult, tough work, which quickly took the edge off our knives. Far below the moors in our sheltered valley, Les took charge of building our shelter. We'd chosen the site for it on loose shale, which was difficult to walk on, but drained well. The only experience most of us had had in building a shelter was what we'd all learned on a 2-day survival course kindly provided by the Army's Royal Engineers. But there wasn't much anybody could teach Les about building.
Probably see when we started with the 2 props at both ends, we put props on the other end, and then the ridge pole through the centre. We put a prop down the front and the prop down the back. Then we found we got it real rigid. Then we started putting other sticks or props down the centre to the ridge, lashing with withy and brambles and wool that had been spun. When we completed that, we interlaced then lengthways across the hut with thinner sticks to act as a batten to take the thatch.
All the reeds had to be carried 2 miles down from the moor and the bundles carefully thatched onto the framework we prepared to make a waterproof, or at least a water-resistant covering. Unfortunately, we underestimated the number of reeds we'd need, and by the end of the first day, our shelter was only half covered. At this point, the film crew withdrew to a cottage on the estate and left us to it. It was a cold, wet night. But by morning, we got a fire going, and we were huddled around it when the crew returned for their daily visit.
Well, I mean, what you could do is come up with us and get going on the reeds, and then after an hour or two, you carry some back here, go on down to the beach and get some food while we stay up there and bring another load. I think it's probably the best way, actually.
At this stage, we still hadn't eaten anything. The most important thing was to finish the shelter. But we also needed food, and to get food, we needed something to collect it in.
I'm cutting reeds, thick ones, for a base. They will be the main spokes of a basket. Hold them. And then I weave with a fine brush. Weave. Having done that, I'll break them again and just start weaving.
Armed with Joyce's baskets, Maggie and Tony went half a mile down to the beach to gather shellfish. Perhaps the commonest shellfish that we found on the shore were limpets. Limpets are easy enough to dislodge with a stone or by prizing them off with a knife, but they're also easily lost, especially on this beach, and they're so leathery to eat that they're hardly worth collecting anyway. But at this stage, we were still experimenting and not quite sure what we were looking for. More rewarding were top shells, of which we ate large numbers, and the other common species, all locked together in a slimy embrace with the limpet, winkles and dogwhelks. To start with, we had little idea how to cope with shellfish when we got them. Joyce carefully prized each dogwhelk out of its home with a thorn. The only other essential item of equipment we took with us was an iron cooking pot, and into this went the unshelled shellfish. We also put in some charlock, gathered from the edge of a field a couple of miles away, and this was all mixed up with the shellfish and some porridge oats already in the pot. Then we stuck the lot on the fire, where we already had some rough oat cakes scorching away, and popped in some seaweed for luck. The result, ladled into tins we'd gathered on the beach, was disgusting.
Yeah. Who's going to be the first victim?
Les. No, he's not.
Yes.
No.
Go on.
Go on, Les. Get it.
Go on, Les.
No, he's not.
Go on, try.
Come on, then. Let me have a go. Here goes. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. Here goes.
You take a second spoonful, it's all right.
Not bad, but we've got the horrible green stuff, yeah.
That's all salt.
That's Charlotte. That horrible green stuff you quite like when you eat
That's
it raw.
seaweed, isn't
Yes,
it?
I don't mind it raw, John. That's the funny part about the thing. I eat a lot of things raw, but
It's different from what I thought. It needs some salt.
definitely.
I never complain about my mother-in-law's cooking again, that's a fact.
As long as you don't find a winkle where you expected a raspberry.
No, it isn't a winkle. On that riverbank one.
It needs salt.
It needs salt. Everything needs salt.
So does that mean we need more seaweed in there?
We can get salt. All we've got to do is take this down, fill it with seawater and evaporate.
Right from the beginning, Les, usually working alongside Barry, took charge of all the heavy work. The loose shale was a menace underfoot, but also a blessing because of the everlasting Exmoor deluge. It was raining when we arrived. It rained all day, most of the next day, and so on day and night for an entire week. 4 inches of rain were recorded in the district within 7 days, the worst September weather on record. In the brief intervals between rainstorms, we tried to stop the leaks in the shelter roof.
That's fine. Can you put one sort of over the top? There. Can you see it?
Oh yes, that's it.
Apart from shelter, of course, food was the first priority. Les was once a part-time poacher. On the tops, high above the campsite, he set wire snares for rabbits. Barry is also a practiced rabbit catcher. Between the two of them, they set about trying to secure a regular supply of fresh meat. But the bulk of our food was remorselessly vegetarian.
These are some of the salad plants that I've been gathering, I've been eating, trying to persuade other people to eat. This is chickweed. It's very common, grows in everybody's garden. It's quite nice to eat raw, or you can cook it and it tastes very like spinach. Then dandelions, everybody knows. Again, you can eat them raw, a little bit bitter, but rather refreshing, very nice. And fungi. These I gathered this morning. The common field mushroom. These are much, much nicer than the ones you buy in the shops. And the big horse mushroom. And for some reason, these get kicked over and destroyed when people find them in fields. And actually, they're just as good as the ordinary little mushrooms. For some reason, people think that they're so big they must be poisonous. As far as I'm concerned, the bigger they are, the better.
We gathered mushrooms on the hill pastures 3 miles or more from the camp. The walk was usually worth it. As well as horse mushrooms, we gathered parasols, perhaps the most delicious of all fungi and the most ignored by the suspicious English. Charlotte was a great standby. It's a member of the cabbage family, and that's exactly how it tastes. Common sorrel has a pleasant lemony tang, and fat hen, a common garden weed, is one of the best of all green vegetables. Elderberries were useful to us, especially for flavouring other food, and of course blackberries, though on Exmoor they were late coming into season. Lime leaves make a nice green sandwich. They don't taste of anything much, but they help to fill your belly, and hunger we quickly got to know all about.
Shouted,
Let's give it a shot, then.
shouted meat tonight. Get the spuds ready, you know.
You'll be lucky.
Oh,
Oh,
Go.
God.
well, I got a pair of fingers. Don't let it go in that fire. Here,
Where's it
give me
going?
a minute. Hold tight.
Trouble is, it's just falling off.
Yes, very nice.
Come on, take the tin, love.
Oh, thank you.
Grab
You made porridge in the liquor.
Where's the back of it?
Yes. Put some oatmeal in there.
Right, make a little, put a little flavour on the stew.
It's upside down. Cheers.
very much.
Here's the first today.
What else?
You mightn't believe it,
No,
that's
thank
nice.
you. What do you do with it?
Eat it. Anybody don't want theirs?
Leave the bone
Wave it
clean.
around.
Les will take the head.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But 8 feet long.
What's the other thing you like? Some for you.
No, there's no...
We don't
Manage
need
it.
Yes. I don't need it.
No, that's great, Barry, isn't it? Not
Leave
just
this
the
out
earth,
of the
leave this.
basket.
Nice.
One of these every day.
Rabbit in the basket.
It's chips.
Oh no!
What?
Sorry, I'd rather not have the head.
We'll have this. then,
Oh,
we'll
that's
have
the
this.
head, sorry.
What do you miss, Joyce, most in the world?
Hot bath. A really hot bath, a leisurely one.
But you hate being dirty anyway, don't you?
And so I have a wash each morning, if you hadn't noticed.
Well, I don't.
In the
I've got
brook.
to admit I haven't.
You'd have us all
Sure.
washed, wouldn't you?
Yes. Oh yes. Nails inspected as well.
Shiny places.
I do believe you would. If you had the chance. What do you miss most?
For me, not being able to take my boots off. My boots off. Well, I can keep your boots on for about 4 days. And I think that's one of the greatest pleasures I had yesterday was to come down here and sat down by this fire and just took my boots off for about half an hour, 20 minutes. But it was a tremendous pleasure to me to do that, take the boots off.
Barry, what about you?
Well, the only thing I really miss is a good clean bed, a nice bed to sleep in, and getting your clothes off to go to bed. Sleeping in all this bulky clothing. It's
Sit down.
ruins you. You feel so restricted. You can't turn or anything, and you can only sleep fitfully for about an hour at a time until you get used to it, I suppose. Once you're used to it, shouldn't be any problem. But at the moment, I'm still having a bit of trouble sleeping. That's the only thing I'm missing.
Maggie?
A lot of things, but I think the thing I think of mostly is food. The food I'm used to. At the home, I'm usually eating nearly all the day, fruit especially, fresh fruit, and
Blackberries?
cups of tea. There's something you can get your teeth into, you know, like a nice crisp apple.
Tony?
Obvious things of food, you know. Cheese I've had a particular craving for the last 2 days. I ate a lot of cheese and coffee. But things like books. I really miss being able to sit down and have a read because I do an awful lot of reading, you know. And playing games, like having a game of chess, something like that. Things to pass the time with in that sort of way.
Using your mind?
Yes, I miss doing that. There's nothing to do here that's really sort of stretching my mind, which of course is something that I've been used to doing 100% of the time for the past, N years.
When it came to practical things like making a deadfall trap using hazel rods and flint points, it was Barry and Les who led the way. They were making this trap to try and kill a fox that was robbing our snare line of rabbits. But the really skilled work, like spinning the wool used to bind on the flint points, this was Joyce's department. Joyce did many things requiring skilled hands, patience and ingenuity. It was Joyce who made a lobster pot out of bramble, holly branches and odd bits of string. It was Joyce who made our first attempts at pottery to replace the tins we found on the beach. Unfortunately, the weather was so wet, the pots never got a chance to dry out. And it was Joyce who constructed a fish trap based on primitive designs which we knew would work given half a chance. Joyce's baskets began in the bramble thickets. Tony's glue came from a pine tree.
Have to keep, just get a bit up and then put the stuff back on the fire. It solidifies very quickly. The fish gets impaled on the centre prong here, and then is held in place by these two outer prongs which have got barbs on them. So it comes in and struggles a bit and can't get up. Obviously we're after quite big fish. We saw some salmon down on the stream, and the small sticks we had then, sharpened, were no good. But a basking salmon ought to be fair game with this thing, I think.
By far the greatest labour for all of us was walking. In order to get to the river, where we hoped to catch salmon and trout, we had to climb up the long hill to the moor, walk high over the tops, feeling quite pathetically weak and exhausted, and then at least a mile down the other side of the hill before we ever got a chance to try out our new toys. But we made it in the end. We baited the fish trap with rabbit guts, which we hoped the trout would fancy, and slipped it into the water. I tied it fast to the bank in case of floods. Unfortunately, the river was already too high, swollen with rain and murky at the bottom. The fish were either invisible or they moved elsewhere. Tony never got a chance to use the spear he was so proud of. But the trip wasn't entirely wasted. While we were there by the river, there was one of those rare patches of thin sunlight that occasionally lifted the clouds for a while. We all made the most of it. We never did catch anything in that river.
Doesn't it strike you a bit, Barry, that people looking at the programme could think, what a ridiculous business. I mean, what a ridiculous waste of time. What are they trying to prove?
No, I would say to these people, just nip out into your local woods for 24 hours. Not 24 hours even, try 12. Just try 12. And see how you feel at the end of that 12. If you were put into this position where you had to live off the land, just each individual ask themselves, how would they fare?
What do you think they might learn?
Learn a lot about themselves, firstly. I think they really would. About wildlife, you learn to blend in a little bit better. You learn to walk more quietly. To study things. You look at everything that's laying around you and think, how can I use this? What can I do with that? Everything you see, you try to turn to your advantage, where in normal life you wouldn't. You'd just kick it to one side.
On the beach, we found all sorts of things we could use. We could have found more, but all of us felt guilty about using the waste products of plastic civilization.
It's quite interesting, some of the things you find on the beach. What amazes me is the amount of plastic. You know, when we're all long gone, there'll be lots of plastic floating around the beaches.
We didn't mean to use flotsam and jetsam like this. The idea was to live off what nature provides, without the interference of men and modern machines. The temptation to recycle all that useful rubbish was just too much. Without anyone consciously planning it, we all adopted daily responsibilities from which we rarely, if ever, departed. Les and Barry always did the wood chopping. Between them, they kept us constantly supplied with fuel. During the whole 2 weeks, the fire was never once allowed to go out. The woodpile was always well stocked.
What I'm trying to do is to strike straight flakes off here, which will be big enough to use as a knife with which to skin a rabbit, just to see if it is possible to do it with flint rather than to do it with the knives we're used to using. One of the things that striking flint does for you is to give you a profound respect for Stone Age man, because of the beauty with which they did their flint knapping. Most of us can only produce pretty crude flakes, and then very, very slowly, by busily chipping away at a flake, get something which approaches to a knife, but nothing like the precision with which even very early Stone Age men could do it.
Right, you can see the skin. Draw your flint. It makes an incision. Careful you don't cut any of the intestines out, you get a nasty mess. Excellent tool.
Camp hygiene was one of our minor problems. Joyce didn't always do the washing up, but the rest of us felt that it was Joyce who set the standards of cleanliness. The spring was only a few yards below the camp, so there was really no excuse to be dirty. But attitudes to cleanliness were one of the few causes for friction in the camp. We divided into those who felt that different circumstances required different standards, and those who believed in keeping up the standards of normal everyday life, however difficult that was to do. Joyce felt that we were not all as clean as we might be.
I think a bit casual, and it worries me. It does worry me. Although, you know, we're away from people here, so we're not in contact with other germs. We're not in contact with smelly fumes and things. But it's still important that the things you eat out of are clean. So I make a point of, very fussy, cleaning things out, turning them upside down, and even my baskets I swill through regularly. For one reason, by swilling my reed baskets through, that keeps them supple anyway. It stops them drying out. Another thing, it does get rid of any slugs that crawl in the night, and we're all very used to slugs now. Of course, these wooden spoons, all very nice. At least it gets the food out of the container. But they could do with a good old scrub, so we'll just give them a good scrub with a stone, and that's it.
On one day, and one day only, the sea was calm and the sun shone palely through thin cloud. We'd all wanted to go down to the beach and wash. Some of us plucked up the courage to swim. The boulders on the beach are tailor-made to trap feet and ankles, so we crawled warily into the icy water. For most of us, it was the only time we came near to taking our clothes off.
Hey, Harry, come on! Come on! Come on, I will come and get you! I'll run faster than you can.
We'd all wanted to go down to the beach and wash. Some of us plucked up the courage to swim. The boulders on the beach are tailor-made to trap feet and ankles, so we crawled warily into the icy water. For most of us, it was the only time we came near to taking our clothes off.
Hey, Harry, come on! Come on! Come on, I will come and get you! I'll run faster than you can. What's it like out there, Gary?
You're telling me that's too cold, boy? That's lovely.
Come on, come on, Les.
No, I can't.
Get your feet wet.
I've got them wet, look.
Come on, Maggie.
That's good.
Guys, get under it. All right, I surrender.
If I don't sleep after that, I'll never sleep. Well, I'll have a headache. Oh, same here. Help! Help! Help!
Ooh.
My mother see that, that'd be it. I'll be on polish for a week.
How much do you all mind having dirty clothes? How much does it matter?
Doesn't matter as long as no one is anyone
It doesn't
sees.
matter until you see
It
them.
matters when people see you.
No, when you see them. I feel that looks awful.
What do you think?
Mine
it
aren't
was?
that
Dirty.
bad.
Well, I can't notice any difference in mine to look at, I must admit.
You mean your clothes are always like that?
Well, I mean, no. They just, this sort of thing doesn't show the dirt very much at all. I mean, you know, to look at that,
There's no dirt on it.
it's an old T-shirt. It doesn't look, it's always been covered up by a jumper.
Don't you find your clothes smell?
I don't know whether it's the
Other
clothes
people-
or me. Now that, yes, that I do object to. I mean, the sort of stench of rhino that I've had around me for the past couple of days, and I realise it's me, it's a bit off-putting. But that's the only thing that bothers me as far as clothing.
You object to your own smell?
Just in the last couple of days, every now and again, I think that's a bit unpleasant. Yeah.
How well have people's clothes and boots stood up to this?
My boots have stood up pretty well. Most of my clothes have stood up pretty well. They're dirty, but they're not torn or damaged in any way.
My boots are useless.
So am I.
Bottoms, the soles are all right. But the uppers, well, it's just like compressed paper, cardboard, as far as I'm concerned. Just got 5 minutes in grass, and wet grass, and they're through to your feet. You can feel the water. And absolutely useless, apart from soap. Good composition soap. Apart from that, you've got it. Clothes are all right.
My
Excellent.
boots are completely useless. They were sold to me as proof against all these things, that proof against acid, proof against oil, proof against alkali, and not
Floor
even
kills
proof
it.
against water.
Floor ruins them.
Not even for half a day.
No.
The first half day that I wore these boots, I walked through some wet grass in a rainstorm, and they were wet through, and that was that. Now out here on the whole, we haven't gone to great lengths to keep clean. You haven't, Liv.
No. I washed once on a Friday. Gale force 9 the next day, so I thought, well, I'm not going to tempt the gods again, so that was it. I'm rather hoping I just stuck my head under the water now. I'm hoping nothing else will happen tomorrow. I have my fingers crossed.
Does a man have to change his standards to go back to nature?
Well, the main difficulties are quite simply that he is a 20th century man used to high level of technology and with the cultural equipment to handle that sort of situation, which of course is just not suited at all for going back to nature. I think this century really has been one of an increasing lack of coordination between us and our environment, also between us and our own bodies. You know, we have to, in this sort of environment, you have to be aware of your own body and of its relationship to what's going on, as much as to all the various forces in the environment. And our culture's just not equipped to handle that sort of thing. We don't think with our bodies, we think with our minds, and that's not the way to handle going back to nature.
Do you think this might also create a tension in time, a conflict?
Well, inevitably. I mean, we couldn't carry on the way we are, clinging on to little sort of vestiges of 20th century civilization. It just wouldn't work, because the two cultures, if you like, the hunting and the industrial, are completely incompatible. I mean, there's no way they can coexist, as far as I see it.
How does that conflict manifest itself then to you?
Difficult to say. Clothing, I think, is one thing. That as much as anyone else, I'm concerned about keeping my clothes relatively clean and certainly dry, and above all, keeping them on, when perhaps it would be a lot better for me to take them off. That's sort of a very basic way in which it works. But the conflict really, again, it's between the mind and the body, as I see it. I'm still trying to think my way through things when perhaps I should be feeling my way through them in an odd sort of way. Mind you, I do feel already that I'm more in tune with the environment. Notice you become aware of the limitations of the environment to support people. And of course, I think that's vitally important in our industrial situation, that we should be aware of the limits of our environment. That's what it's all about, really.
The most determined hunter was Barry. The crossbow he made out of hazel and willow bark, and arrows with delicate flint tips. Too bad he never got close enough to anything to shoot it. It was surprising how very simple tasks like collecting bilberries could give one food for thought.
It was simply picturing myself going through these berries, and it suddenly occurred to me how exactly like a chimpanzee feeding I was looking. It was just a sheer sort of mechanical necessity. One just moved on foraging. Well, it's quite a surprising thing, I think, and it really brings it home to you that we are just nothing more than a primate.
The trouble was, we weren't monkeys, nor were we organised and equipped like real hunting people, as Maggie had already pointed out.
And I think this situation also is completely reversed from primitive people, where the women did the heavy work. Well, here the tendency is for the men to go out hunting. And Joyce and myself, well, we haven't done anything very heavy at all. I don't know whether this is the idea that modern society was given us or what, but it is completely reversed what it was.
Would you like to go out hunting?
I'd love to.
Why don't you say so?
Well, I don't know, it just seems, you just sort of seem to have different jobs, you know, for different people. I think Barry and Les do the hunting, really, and you sometimes. And it's just sort of settled into a little niche.
It's only setting snares.
Well, yeah, setting snares, I know, but I'd love to have a go, really. I'd like to have a go at everything. I don't really want to let my sex have anything to do with it. That's how I'd like it, anyway.
All our attitudes began to change. Maggie, who days before would probably not have swatted a bluebottle, set snares for rabbits, even though snares are a nasty way to kill anything. Final score of rabbits was Fox 2, us 6. After the first few days, we longed to knock off a sheep or two, though we knew it was cheating and illegal besides. We were beginning not to care. The same went for the deer. Though we recognized their beauty, we lost many of our finer feelings about them, and in the end, hunger drove us to try and catch them.
Will that make it drop right less on that knot there?
Yeah.
How about it?
Yeah, we'll get pulled in.
Is that high enough?
We didn't know it at the time, but it is in fact illegal to set snares for deer. In normal circumstances, it's also disgustingly cruel.
It's a measure of how far we'd changed our attitudes that we even tried to catch them, but we didn't try very hard. The deer easily found our snares and snootily walked round them. When I look back, I can only be glad that they did. We came to depend more and more on the beach for our source of food. Tired of shellfish and nauseated by seaweed, we tried our hands at catching lobsters. Lacking a boat, we had to wait for the lowest ebb of the tide and take our pot right down to the water's edge. Les weighted it heavily with rocks and secured it to a boulder. But the same night, a storm got up. By the morning, the pot had gone forever. It was back to the winkles again. We all, even those of us who never normally ate them, became avid winkle and whelk eaters. Our bodies demanded the protein. Funnily enough, we never finished the bag of oats. A daily allowance of about 3 ounces per head gave us about all we could stomach. This provided perhaps 300 or 400 calories per day, and we were burning up around 2,000. Winkles and whelks, as well as all the berries, mushrooms and green stuff, helped to close the gap. Even so, in 2 short weeks, we learned just a little of what it's like to be permanently hungry. We lost an average of about 8 pounds apiece, and all of us felt weakened for want of food. Boring things like sex never came up at all. All our fantasies were of food.
Nicely cooked.
Very nice.
To a turn.
Just to a turn.
Do well with a little lemon juice
With anything.
and brown bread and butter.
Welsh salted butter. Thick.
Of course. Is there any other kind?
About a quarter of an inch thick.
What's your favourite food fantasy, friend?
Meat of any kind. A real good mouthful of chewy meat.
You have this thing about the sheep here, don't you?
Yeah.
What would you like to do?
Have one on a spit over here.
You've got designs on the sheep.
I think I can get through half a sheep on my own at the moment. Without any difficulty whatsoever. I think Les could get rid of the other half.
Yes, but I don't actually crave for meat, funny part about it. I don't crave for anything in particular, but what I would like is a nice nobbin off a new loaf, covered in about a quarter of an inch thick of nice salted butter. I think I would go, well, go down tremendously. But I don't actually crave for it.
Joyce, what would you like?
You know, a real old-fashioned flapjack with syrup and cherries and nuts in, and minimum of oats. Cooked beautifully brown, and eaten hot. Super.
Sounds great.
Does, doesn't it? Far better than our
Bread and butter, I think. Lovely.
than the porridge. Bread and butter, I think.
Top half of a cottage loaf,
Something crusty
cut in half.
that you can get your teeth into.
You know, where you can hold in both hands
Super
like this and sink your
butter.
teeth into it.
Yes.
And the butter goes around both sides of your teeth. Lovely, absolutely gorgeous.
Mine,
Yeah.
really nice salad. A
Oh.
really nice mixed
No, it's
salad.
chewing food, I want.
Oh,
Something I
we'll
can
have
chew.
something like cold meat to go with it.
My teeth have grown a quarter of an inch since I played. Yeah.
By the 13th day, we'd slowed down to a steady rhythm. None of us had so much as a sniffle of illness, but we sorely missed some of the things which I, for one, would rather not have missed. Hot baths and comfy beds, familiar food, dry clothes, even motor cars to take away the drudgery of walking eternally uphill. 2 weeks was just not long enough to wean us completely from the life we were used to. But we learned a lot about ourselves and a lot about the things our society holds important. In worldly terms, Les, for instance, was probably the worst paid of all of us. On Exmoor, he was the strongest of us all, not just physically, but morally too. What has been the main effect that everybody's noticed over the last 12 days, 11 days, on themselves?
Lack of energy, as far as I'm concerned. Complete lack of energy. First week, I coped. But now this last 3 or 4 days, it's really beginning to bug me. You still think you can do exactly the same work as you've done when you came into this. But you immediately start, and I don't know, about half an hour after you started work in the morning, like that, you seem to fall away completely.
Joyce, what do you think's been the most difficult thing about this whole thing?
Being so uncomfortable, damp, muddy, smelly. You know, the lack of extra clothes, the knowing that if you got wet, you're going to be wet until the wind dried you. That kind of thing, I think, mostly.
Do you think we could survive indefinitely, Les?
Yes, definitely. The simple reason is this, as the days go on, then we get more accustomed to this. I grant we're slowing down, we all know we're slowing down. But you would adapt to that pace of slowing down, wouldn't you? The jobs that you've done, you would adapt to that slowing down. Is obviously, the longer you stop in this situation, the more you learn. Obviously you would hunt better, your knowledge of wild animals would increase that much, so you could catch them easier. As you say, we should have more fish traps, more lobster pots and whatnot. We could even build tidal traps out on the seashore. Oh, definitely, I would say you could survive. Your shelter, you would improve your shelter. You wouldn't stop with the thing that we've got now. We would, obviously, we would come back to our own civilization given time. As regards building shelters, we've got that knowledge of building shelters. But I definitely think that we could survive, definitely.
On the final morning, we took a rather different route from usual. We may not have been purists, but we all felt that we'd proved something to ourselves, if only that there are many things in life that we can perfectly well do without. At the same time, we were filled with a kind of unholy joy at the prospect ahead of us, the lonely cafe that stands at County Gate. It was back to civilization.
Cup of coffee, please, lad. Coffee? Yes. Cup of coffee and a chocolate bar.
Right, yeah.
Cup of coffee and food. What are you going to have?
Coffee and anything.
Coffee and anything?
Yes.
You got coffee and anything?
Well,
What do you want? What do you want?
strong coffee, lots of it.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Spoons. And a cream glass and What's to have first?
Are you running into your beard, Les?
Best I've had in a fortnight.
You don't realise how nice it tastes. You can't remember how nice it tastes, really. You really can't.